September 1942. The skies over Europe they were a death trap. American B-17 bombers, those flying fortresses everyone talks about, they were being torn apart, systematically, brutally, by German fighters. The losses they were catastrophic. On some missions, 1 out of every 4 bombers didn't come home. Think about that for a second. 1 in 4. Young men, 20, maybe 22 years old, climbing into those planes, knowing the odds. The 8th Air Force was bleeding out over Germany. And the real problem, wasn't the bombers themselves. It was that they were flying alone, deep into enemy territory with no one to protect them. The fighters they had, the P-47 Thunderbolts, the P-38 Lightnings, good planes, solid planes, but they could only go so far, about halfway to the target, maybe a bit more. Then they had to turn back. Fuel. It always came down to fuel. And that's when the Luftwaffe would strike, like wolves waiting for the shepherd to leave. They knew exactly when the escorts would peel away, and they'd come in, wave after wave, tearing through those bomber formations. The Americans were losing the air war, plain and simple. Something had to change, or the entire strategic bombing campaign, everything they'd planned, everything they'd sacrificed for, it was going to collapse. Now, here's where it gets interesting. The plane that would change everything, the plane that would eventually dominate the skies over Europe and break the back of the Luftwaffe, it almost didn't happen. In fact, when it first flew, the Army Air Forces didn't even want it. The P-51 Mustang, at least in its original form, was mediocre. Underpowered, couldn't compete at high altitudes where the real fighting happened. The British ordered it out of desperation in 1940, needed fighters, needed them fast, and North American aviation promised to design and build a completely new fighter in just 120 days. Crazy timeline, but they did it. Problem was, with the Allison engine it had, the thing was a dog above 15,000 feet. Down low, close to the ground, it was beautiful, fast, handled like a dream, but up high, where the bombers flew, where it needed to be, it just couldn't perform. The British, though, they saw something. They saw the airframe, the design, and they thought, what if we put a different engine in this thing? What if we put a Rolls-Royce engine in it? That same engine that powered the Spitfire, one of the best fighters in the world. So they did. They took a P-51, pulled out that Allison engine, and dropped in a Merlin. And everything changed. Suddenly, this mediocre fighter became something else entirely. The performance jumped dramatically. Speed increased, climb rate improved, but most importantly, it could fight at altitude now. It could go where the bombers went. Back in the States, Packard Motor Company was already building Merlin engines under license, and when the test results came back from Britain, when they saw what this combination could do, the light bulbs went off. This was it. This was the answer they'd been searching for. By late 1942, North American aviation was building P-51Bs and Cs with Packard Merlin engines, and the Army Air Forces, the same ones who'd barely given it a second glance before, they started paying attention. But even then, even with this incredible fighter coming online, they were still thinking of it as just another fighter, tactical support, escort for medium bombers, that sort of thing. They hadn't yet grasped what it could really do. The real breakthrough came down to one thing, one crucial modification: drop tanks. External fuel tanks that could be jettisoned when empty or when combat started. Sounds simple, right? But this was the key, the absolute key to everything that followed. With drop tanks, the Mustang's range exploded. It could fly to Berlin and back. Think about that. Berlin, the heart of Nazi Germany. And that changed the entire equation of the air war. Suddenly, American bombers wouldn't be alone anymore. Suddenly, they'd have protection all the way to the target and all the way back. The Luftwaffe's free hunting season, it was about to end. December 1943, the first P-51Bs arrived in England, assigned to the 9th Air Force initially, but it didn't take long before the 8th Air Force, the ones running those deep penetration raids into Germany, they wanted them. They needed them. And in early 1944, the Mustangs started flying escort missions for the heavy bombers. The impact was immediate. German pilots who'd grown accustomed to attacking bomber formations with relative impunity. Sure, they'd face defensive fire from the bombers themselves, but once those short-range escorts turned back, they owned the sky. Now, suddenly there were American fighters staying with the bombers, matching them mile for mile, and these weren't just any fighters. These were fast, nimble, and flown by pilots who were getting better, more experienced, more aggressive with every mission. The P-51D, which started arriving in mid-1944, that was the definitive version. Bubble canopy for better visibility, 650 caliber machine guns, and that same incredible range. Pilots loved it, loved everything about it. It was fast, over 400 miles per hour at altitude. It could outturn most German fighters. It could outdive them. And it had the legs to stay in the fight, to go anywhere the bombers went. The Germans, they called it the Gabelschwanz Teufel when they were talking about the P-38, the fork-tailed devil. But the Mustang they learned to fear in a different way. It was everywhere. You couldn't escape it. Now, let's talk about what this actually meant, tactically, strategically. Before the Mustang arrived in numbers, the 8th Air Force was losing bombers at an unsustainable rate. The Schweinfurt raids in October 1943, the second one especially, they lost 60 bombers in a single mission. 60. That's 600 men dead or captured in one day. The deep raids into Germany had to be suspended after that. They simply couldn't continue taking losses like that. But by spring of 1944, with Mustangs escorting the bombers, loss rates dropped dramatically. Not to zero, nothing could make it safe, but manageable, sustainable. The bombing campaign could continue, could intensify even. But here's where it gets really interesting, where the Mustang's impact went beyond just escort duty. General Jimmy Doolittle, when he took command of the 8th Air Force in January 1944, he made a decision that was controversial at the time, but it turned out to be brilliant. He told his fighter pilots, don't just stay with the bombers, go hunting. Seek out and destroy German fighters wherever you find them. On the ground, in the air, doesn't matter. Find them and kill them. This was a fundamental shift in doctrine. Before, fighters were defensive, protecting the bombers, staying close. Now they were offensive weapons, and the Mustang, with its range and performance, was perfect for this role. So Mustang pilots started going down on the deck, strafing German airfields, catching fighters on the ground where they were vulnerable, destroying them before they could even take off. They'd patrol ahead of bomber formations, above them, around them, looking for German fighters forming up for attacks. And when they found them, they'd bounce them, hit them hard. The Luftwaffe, which had been the most feared air force in the world just a few years earlier, it started to crumble. Not all at once, but steadily, relentlessly. The Germans were losing experienced pilots they couldn't replace. They were losing planes faster than they could build them, even though production was actually increasing. The Mustangs they were everywhere. There's a story, one of many, from March 1944. A Mustang pilot named Chuck Yeager, yeah, that Chuck Yeager, the one who later broke the sound barrier, he was flying escort for a bomber mission. Got separated from his group, ended up alone over France. Spotted a German airfield, decided to take a look. Came down low and saw dozens of German planes lined up, just sitting there. He made several passes, strafing, destroying aircraft after aircraft. When his ammunition ran out, he headed home. That was the kind of thing that started happening regularly. German planes burning on the ground, pilots who never even got a chance to fight back. By D-Day, June 6, 1944, the Allies had achieved air superiority over Western Europe. Not just locally, not just temporarily, but complete, overwhelming air superiority. German fighters rarely appeared over the invasion beaches. When they did, they were quickly driven off or shot down. And this wasn't just because of the Mustang, of course. There were thousands of Allied aircraft involved, but the Mustang played a crucial role in achieving and maintaining that superiority. It could range deep, protect the bombers that were destroying German industry, and hunt down German fighters wherever they tried to operate. The numbers, when you look at them, they tell the story. Mustangs were credited with destroying about 4,950 enemy aircraft in air-to-air combat, more than any other Allied fighter in the European theater. But that doesn't include all the planes destroyed on the ground, and that number was significant, probably thousands more. The kill ratio, the number of enemy aircraft destroyed versus Mustangs lost, it was heavily in the Mustangs' favor. Somewhere around 8-1, maybe higher depending on how you count it. That's not just a good fighter, that's dominance. Let's talk about some of the pilots, because the plane was only as good as the men flying it. Don Gentile, they called him the Falcon of Fremont, scored 30 victories, became one of the top American aces. George Preddy, he got 26 kills, was the top Mustang ace before he was killed in December 1944. Tragic friendly fire incident. John Meyer, Leonard Kit Carson. These were names that became legendary. But it wasn't just the aces, it was all the pilots, hundreds of them, who flew those missions day after day, escorting bombers, dogfighting with German pilots who were skilled and experienced, if increasingly outnumbered and outmatched. The German perspective on this is, it's illuminating. By late 1944, German pilots were facing impossible odds. They take off, often in planes that were technically superior in some ways, the Focke-Wulf 190, the Messerschmitt 109, especially the later versions. These were good aircraft, but they were outnumbered, often massively, and fuel shortages meant training for new pilots had been cut way back. The German pilot by late 1944 might have 100 hours of flight time before being thrown into combat. American pilots had 200-300 hours, sometimes more. Experience matters, especially in a dogfight. And then there was the fuel situation. Germany was running out of fuel. The synthetic oil plants that produced aviation fuel, they were priority targets for Allied bombers escorted by, you guessed it, Mustangs. The more the Allies bombed these plants, the less fuel Germany had. The less fuel Germany had, the less they could train pilots and operate fighters. The less they operated fighters, the easier it was for Mustangs to dominate the sky. It was a death spiral, and the Mustang was at the center of it, both as the sword, destroying German industry and fighters, and as the shield, protecting the bombers, doing the destroying. There's a mission from February 1944, Big Week they called it, a sustained bombing campaign against German aircraft production facilities. The goal was to destroy the factories building German fighters, to cripple the Luftwaffe's ability to replace losses. Mustangs flew escort on these missions, missions that went to Regensburg, to Schweinfurt, to Leipzig, deep into Germany. The Germans threw everything they had at these raids. The air battles were massive, hundreds of aircraft, chaotic, deadly. But the bombers got through, dropped their bombs, and came home, most of them anyway. And the factories were hit, hard. German fighter production was disrupted, set back by months, and the Luftwaffe lost fighters and pilots defending those factories, losses they could ill afford. By the time the war in Europe ended in May 1945, the Luftwaffe was essentially finished. They had planes, some of them jets even, the Me-262, which was faster than anything the Allies had, but they didn't have fuel, didn't have experienced pilots, didn't have the infrastructure to operate effectively. The Mustang hadn't destroyed the Luftwaffe alone, but it had been the tip of the spear, the weapon that made the strategic bombing campaign possible, that made air superiority achievable and sustainable. After the war ended, when historians and military analysts looked back, they tried to identify the weapons, the technologies, the decisions that had been decisive, that had really changed the outcome. And the P-51 Mustang was always on that list. Some went further, arguing it was the single most important fighter of the war, at least in the European theater. That's debatable, sure, you can make arguments for other aircraft, other weapon systems. But what's not debatable is that the Mustang changed the air war fundamentally. It solved the escort problem, it gave the Allies long-range offensive fighter capability they'd never had before, and it broke the Luftwaffe. The design itself, when you look at it from an engineering perspective, it was elegant. The laminar flow wing, which reduced drag and increased speed, that was cutting edge at the time. The way the radiator was positioned under the fuselage, using the cooling system to actually generate thrust, recovering energy that would normally be wasted, that was brilliant. North American Aviation had designed the thing in 120 days, but they'd done it right. The airframe was solid, adaptable. When they needed to put a bigger engine in it, they could. When they needed to add more fuel, they could. When they needed to hang bombs or rockets under the wings for ground attack work, they could. It was a versatile platform. And it wasn't just in Europe. Mustangs served in the Pacific too, though they arrived later and in smaller numbers. The distances in the Pacific were even greater than in Europe, and the Mustang's range made it valuable there as well. Escorting B-29s on raids against Japan, flying from Iwo Jima once that island was captured, the Mustang proved it could do the job in a completely different theater against a completely different enemy. The Japanese didn't have the same industrial capacity Germany had, but their pilots, especially early in the war, were skilled and aggressive. By the time Mustangs arrived in numbers, though, by 1945, Japanese pilot quality had declined, and the Mustang was it was one more weapon in an overwhelming arsenal. Let's think about the bigger picture for a moment, about what air superiority actually meant for the outcome of the war. Without it, D-Day might not have been possible, or at least would have been far more costly. Without it, the strategic bombing campaign would have failed or abandoned. Without it, German industry might have continued producing weapons at high rates for longer. The Mustang wasn't the only factor in achieving air superiority, but it was a key factor, maybe the key factor. And air superiority, that translated directly into victory on the ground. There's something almost poetic about the Mustang's origin story, about how it almost didn't happen, how the plane that would become legendary was initially rejected, unwanted. If the British hadn't seen potential in that airframe, if they hadn't thought to put a Merlin engine in it, if Packard hadn't been building those engines in the States, if drop tanks hadn't been developed and employed, any one of those things goes differently, and maybe the Mustang never becomes what it became. Maybe the air war over Europe drags on longer, costs more lives. Maybe the outcome is the same, but the path to get there is bloodier. History is full of these contingencies, these moments where things could have gone either way. After the war ended, after the parades and the celebrations, after everyone came home or didn't come home, the Mustang kept flying. Air forces around the world used them for years. The Israelis flew them in their War of Independence in 1948. Various air forces in Latin America, Asia, kept them in service into the 1980s in some cases. And in the civilian world, at air shows, at races, restored Mustangs became some of the most prized warbirds. That distinctive sound, the Merlin engine's roar, you can still hear it today if you go to the right air shows. There's something about seeing one in flight, the way it moves, the grace and power of it, that connects you to that history, to what that plane represented and accomplished. The men who flew them, those who survived, they had stories, thousands of stories, about missions that went wrong, about close calls, about friends who didn't come back, about the cold at 30,000 feet, about flak bursts that shook the plane, about dogfights that lasted seconds but felt like hours, about the fear they felt but pushed down, the job they had to do. Some of them wrote books, gave interviews, spoke at schools and museums. They wanted people to remember, to understand what they'd done, what it had cost. And they always spoke with respect, almost affection, about the Mustang. It had brought them home. It had given them a chance when the odds were bad. It was, in their words, the best fighter of the war. Now think about the German pilots on the other end of this, the ones facing Mustangs day after day. Some of them survived the war, told their stories too, and they talked about how the situation changed, how by 1944 they knew they were fighting a losing battle. They'd see formations of bombers, hundreds of them, with fighters swarming around them like bees, and they'd know that attacking was probably suicidal, but they'd do it anyway because that was their duty, that was their job. Some of the German accounts talk specifically about the Mustang, about how it was different from earlier American fighters, faster, more maneuverable, and always there, always present. For German pilots, by late in the war, seeing Mustangs was it was normal, expected, and dreaded. The industrial aspect of this story, the production side, that's worth understanding too. North American aviation went from a contract to build a new fighter to producing thousands of them in just a few years. At peak production, they were building hundreds of Mustangs per month. The factories in Inglewood, California and Dallas, Texas, they were running multiple shifts, tens of thousands of workers, mostly women during the war years while the men were off fighting. These workers were building these complex machines, precision work. Quality control was critical because a mistake could mean a pilot's life. And they did it, built over 15,000 Mustangs by the end of production. That's American industrial capacity at its peak. That ability to design something, tool up for it, and produce it at scale. Cost-wise, a P-51D cost about $50,000 to build during the war. In today's money, that's maybe $700,000 or so, accounting for inflation. Compare that to what modern fighter jets cost, $30, $50, $100 million or more, and you get a sense of scale. Of course, they're not comparable in capability. A modern fighter is exponentially more complex and capable, but still, the contrast is striking. The Mustang was relatively cheap, relatively simple, and could be produced in large numbers. That mattered. Quantity has a quality all its own, as someone once said. Let's talk about one specific mission, just to give you a sense of what it was like. March 6, 1944. A major raid on Berlin, the first big daylight raid on the German capital by the 8th Air Force. Hundreds of B-17s and B-24s escorted by fighters, including P-51s. The bombers took heavy losses, 69 lost, but they hit Berlin, proved it could be done. The Mustang pilots that day, they were in combat most of the way to the target and most of the way back. German fighters came up in force, trying to break through to the bombers. The dogfights were intense, scattered across hundreds of miles of sky. Some Mustang pilots claimed multiple kills that day. Others were shot down, captured, or killed. It was chaos, violent and deadly, but the bombers got through and the mission was counted as a success, strategically at least. For the men involved, for the ones who didn't come back, success is a complicated word. One of the interesting tactical developments was how the escort tactics evolved over time. Early on, the doctrine was close escort, stay tight with the bombers, don't leave them. But that meant the fighters were reacting to German attacks rather than preventing them. Doolittle's change to allow fighters to range ahead and hunt aggressively, that was a paradigm shift. It meant fewer German fighters even reached the bombers because they were being engaged earlier, before they could set up their attacks. The Mustang's performance and range made this possible. Shorter-ranged fighters couldn't do it because they'd burn too much fuel and not make it home. There were variations of the Mustang, too, different roles. The F-6 was a photo reconnaissance version, carried cameras instead of guns in some cases, used for flying over enemy territory to take pictures of targets, damage assessment after raids, that sort of thing. Fast and with long range, it was perfect for that mission. There were also Mustangs modified for ground attack work, carrying bombs and rockets, used in tactical roles supporting ground troops after D-Day. The basic design was adaptable, could be modified for different missions. That versatility added to its value. Weather played a huge role in the air war, and the Mustang pilots had to deal with it constantly. European weather is notoriously bad: clouds, fog, rain, icing conditions at altitude. Formation flying in those conditions was difficult and dangerous. Planes would get separated, lost, run out of fuel trying to find their way home. Some pilots they disappeared, never found, probably went down in the North Sea or crashed in remote areas. Not every loss was due to enemy action. The weather killed plenty of pilots all by itself. The psychological aspect of flying these missions, that's something worth considering. These pilots were flying 4, 5, 6-hour missions, often at high altitude where it was 50, 60 degrees below zero, in unpressurized cockpits. They'd be breathing oxygen through masks, wearing bulky flight suits and gear. They'd see friends shot down, see bombers exploding, see parachutes, or not see them. And then they'd land, debrief, maybe get some food and rest, and do it again the next day if weather permitted. The stress was enormous. Some men broke under it. Combat fatigue, they called it. Others kept going, mission after mission, until their tour was up or they were shot down or killed. The aces, the ones who shot down 5 or more enemy aircraft, they got the attention, the medals, the publicity. But for every ace, there were dozens of pilots who flew just as bravely, just as skillfully, but didn't happen to get into the right position at the right time to score kills. Combat is chaotic. Luck plays a role. Being in the right place, seeing the enemy before he sees you, having ammunition when you need it, not having your guns jam. All these little factors determined who got kills and who didn't. But they were all doing the same job, facing the same dangers, contributing to the same mission. By early 1945, the end was in sight. Germany was collapsing, being squeezed from east and west, bombed from the air day and night. The Luftwaffe, which had started the war as the most modern air force in the world, was a shadow of itself. The Me-262 jet fighter, which Germany deployed in late 1944, was faster than the Mustang, could have been a game-changer if they'd had it earlier and in greater numbers. But by the time it appeared, it was too late, too little. And even jets need fuel and trained pilots and infrastructure, none of which Germany had in sufficient quantities by that point. Mustangs learned to catch Me-262s during takeoff and landing when the jets were slow and vulnerable. They couldn't match them in speed in the air, but they didn't have to. They just had to make operating them unsustainable. When Germany surrendered on May 8, 1945, the air war in Europe was over. The Mustang had been in frontline service for less than 2 years in that theater, but in that time it had changed everything. The pilots came home, those who survived. The planes, many of them were scrapped or sold off as surplus. Some ended up in other countries' air forces, others were bought by civilians. A few were preserved in museums. Most were just destroyed, cut up for scrap metal. They'd served their purpose. The war was over. Looking back now, 80 years later, it's easy to see the P-51 Mustang as inevitable, as obviously the right solution. But at the time, nothing was obvious. There were competing designs, different approaches, bureaucratic obstacles, production challenges. The fact that it came together the way it did, that the right engine got paired with the right airframe at the right time, that drop tanks got developed and employed, that tactics evolved to make best use of the plane's capabilities. All of that required thousands of people making the right decisions, often under pressure, often without perfect information. The legacy of the Mustang extends beyond the war itself. It influenced post-war fighter design, proved the value of long-range escort fighters, demonstrated what was possible with careful engineering and good design. The lessons learned about drop tanks, about fighter tactics, about the importance of range and versatility, those carried forward into the jet age. The next generation of fighters, the F-86 Sabre that fought in Korea, that owed something to the Mustang's example. And there's the cultural impact, too, the way the Mustang became iconic, a symbol of American air power, of the Allied victory in World War II. It appears in movies, in books, in video games. It's one of the most recognizable aircraft ever built. People who know nothing about aviation, they've heard of the Mustang. They've seen pictures of it. That sleek profile, that bubble canopy, the invasion stripes painted on some of them for D-Day. It's all part of our collective memory of the war. For the generation that fought World War II, the greatest generation as they're sometimes called, the Mustang represented something important. It represented American ingenuity, the ability to see a problem and solve it. It represented bravery, the young men who climbed into those cockpits and flew into harm's way. And it represented hope, the possibility that the war could be won, that freedom could prevail over tyranny. Those might sound like grandiose terms, but for people living through that time, facing that existential threat, they weren't grandiose. They were real, immediate concerns, and the Mustang was part of the answer. So, yeah, the P-51 Mustang, the plane that won the air war. Not alone, never alone, but as a crucial piece of a larger effort. The right plane at the right time, flown by the right people, doing the right job. In war, in history, that's about as good as it gets. The cost was high, in lives and resources and suffering, but the outcome was the destruction of Nazi Germany, the liberation of Europe, the end of the Holocaust. And the Mustang played its part in that, played it well. When you see one today at an air show or in a museum, take a moment. Think about what that machine represents, what it accomplished, what it cost. Think about the young men who flew it, who trusted their lives to it, some of whom it brought home and some of whom it couldn't. History isn't just dates and facts, it's people, real people who lived through extraordinary times and did extraordinary things. The Mustang is a link to that history, a reminder of what was at stake and what was achieved. And if you found this deep dive into the P-51 Mustang interesting, there's more history to explore. Click on that next video, and I'll see you there.